Several things happened in the past little while that I want to talk about, so I figured we would try going through a few things over, let's say, 2 videos. This is a new thing for me, so please let me know how you feel about it. Anyways, let's begin with the story that I found the absolute most infuriating. On August 18, 2017, the United Nations released a document titled Prevention of Racial Discrimination, including early warning and urgent action procedures, which is a formal recommendation of action directed toward the United States in the wake of the Charlottesville violence. It reads, recalling the horrific events in Charlottesville, leading to the death of Miss Heather Heyer, and the injuries inflicted on many other protesters, as well as the terrible beating of Mr. DeAndre Harris by white supremacists. Alarmed by the racist demonstrations, with overtly racist slogans, chants, and salutes by individuals belonging to groups of white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and the Ku Klux Klan, promoting white supremacy and inciting racial discrimination and hatred. Disturbed by the failure at the highest political level of the United States of America to unequivocally reject and condemn the racist violent events and demonstrations led by the aforementioned groups, thereby potentially fueling the proliferation of racist discourse and incidents throughout the state party, and deeply concerned by the example this failure could set for the rest of the world. Now, don't get me wrong here, I am in no way in favor of people going out to the streets to be overtly racist, and this is an accurate depiction of what happened in Charlottesville. But where does the United Nations get off talking about how deeply offended they are about what citizens of the United States are doing well within the confines of its laws? I mean, seriously, is this not just the United Nations virtue signaling about how awful all these racists are, and how they're so deeply offended that there could even be such racist people? This is all emotional drivel, and as an entity, I don't want my country to be given an emotional and moral condemnation by a bunch of busybodies at the United Nations. Noting the criminal investigation launched against and the ongoing prosecution of the individual implicated in the plowing of his car into the crowd of peaceful protesters which led to the death of Miss Heyer, emphasizing that there should be no place in the world for racist white supremacist ideas or any similar ideologies that reject the core human rights principles of human dignity and equality, and seek to degrade the standing of individuals and groups on the grounds of race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, and recalling Article 1 of the Convention. I'm just gonna say it. You do not believe in human dignity or equality. 1 woman murdered and 23 injured by some racist maniac with a car, and you find it expedient to deliver writings condemning it. Meanwhile, there are literal white genocides going on in Zimbabwe and South Africa, and the silence about it from the United Nations is deafening. You can accuse me of whataboutery here because you would be correct, but this is a clear value judgment, because to name one of these events and not the other is placing greater value on one of them than the other, and it is specifically saying that 1 woman being murdered in the United States is of greater value than thousands of people being raped, beaten, tortured, and killed in 2 other countries where their respective states are turning a blind eye to it, if not encouraging it. So when you sit there and give a statement like this, just because what Donald Trump said wasn't satisfactory to you, you cannot then say that you believe in the idea of equality, because human lives aren't even of equal value to you. And this is ignoring the racial elements of either situation at this point. It's important to note before we continue that this document isn't any kind of legislation directed at the United States that might force or compel us to take any action in one direction or another. Functionally, it's more of a criticism and this UN committee saying, we would like it if you did these things we say. So basically, it's the United Nations giving their opinion on a domestic matter in a sovereign nation. But the next section does contain some actions that the United Nations is asking the United States to take. The United Nations calls upon the United States of America to fully respect its international obligations, in particular those arising from the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, to combat and eliminate all forms of racial discrimination. Calls upon the government of the United States of America, including the high-level politicians and public officials, not only to unequivocally and unconditionally reject and condemn racist hate speech and racist crimes in Charlottesville and throughout the country, but also to actively contribute to the promotion of understanding, tolerance, and diversity between ethnic groups, and acknowledge their contribution to the history and diversity of the United States of America. There is no such thing as hate speech in the United States of America. We are a country that believes in the idea of free speech being a basic human right, because we are not of the mind that we can or even should control what people in our country think. The United Nations urges the United States of America to ensure that all human rights violations which took place in Charlottesville, in particular with regard to the death of Miss Heyer, are thoroughly investigated, alleged perpetrators prosecuted, and if convicted, punished with sanctions commensurate to the gravity of the crime, and provide effective remedies to victims and their families. I don't even understand why anyone would take the time to say this. This guy murdered someone with his car intentionally and injured 19 other people in the process. If James Fields doesn't get the death penalty, he'll be spending the rest of his life in prison from the murder alone. And that isn't even adding in the 8 counts of malicious wounding he's already been charged with, which on their own would result in him being charged with 160 years in prison, with 0 chance of parole. This man will never walk the streets again, and anyone who was directly associated with this doesn't have a snowball's chance in the desert of spending less than 20 years in prison. These last 2 parts I'll take care of together. The United Nations recommends that the government of the United States of America identify and take concrete measures to address the root causes of the proliferation of such racist manifestations, and thoroughly investigate the phenomena of racial discrimination, targeting in particular against people of African descent or ethno-religious minorities and migrants. And 5. Recommends that the United States of America ensure that rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly are not exercised with the aim of destroying or denying rights and freedoms of others, especially the right to equality and non-discrimination, and that the government of the United States of America provide the necessary guarantees so that such rights are not misused to promote racist hate speech and racist crimes. And here is what really got my goat and made me want to make a video about this. Exactly who does the United Nations think they are where they can tell us how to run one of the largest countries in the world? Not only that, but recommending to us that we break our own constitution and curb the free speech of our citizens just because people say things. No, just because people have ideas that they do not like. Let me tell you what the root cause of the proliferation of such racist manifestations actually are. They are people, Americans, seeing a problem in their country, seeing how they're being treated by the political aristocracy, the media, and people from social groups outside of their own, seeing the kinds of rhetoric that gets thrown around from all 3 groups. And in the case of the alt-right, coming to the conclusion that a fundamental part of their existence is under attack, and that there is no way to defend it than to form a movement centered around ensuring the existence of their own group, which happens to be white people in this particular context. The conclusions they've come to, and their reasoning, is stupid. It's idiotic, it's backwards, and it's wrong. However, I will not for a second tolerate them being silenced and forbidden from publicly espousing their idiotic ideas. When that happens, people like myself aren't given an opportunity to combat their ideas. We aren't allowed an opportunity to point out their shortcomings and explain peacefully where they've gone astray in their formulations. You instead create the situation where the state must oppress people just for simply thinking the wrong way. And in doing so, you legitimize their idiotic ramblings and create the very monster they swear exists, just because you thought it would be a good idea to forcibly stop people from having wrongthink. You at the United Nations have clearly not figured this out yet, despite the annals of history having shown this time and time again. You people are ignorant and out of touch. When you say that we need to provide the necessary guarantees that such rights are not misused to promote racist hate speech and racist crimes, that's not something that anyone could ever guarantee. You cannot legislate away bad or wrong ideas. And for your information, it already is illegal for someone to use their freedom of speech to promote crimes in general. This is what I was getting at earlier. These people do not care about human rights. They care about people having only the ideas that they agree with. And I'm sorry, but we will not start thought policing our fellow Americans. Not now, not ever. We didn't ask for your opinion, and quite frankly, we don't want it. So you can take these recommendations of yours and shove them. Now, let's move from here to California, where the lunatics seem to be running the asylum. California legislators are set to vote this week on a bill that could criminalize using the wrong pronoun to refer to a transgender individual. The bill, which passed the California State Senate in May, has moved into the California State Assembly as part of a slew of gender-based anti-discrimination laws designed to protect California residents who don't believe they fall into the gender binary. Do you remember being told by progressives that, oh no, there's no way anyone was going to try and put you in jail for not using someone's pronouns? It's just a symbolic law. It doesn't actually mean anything. Who is shocked that all of that was malarkey? Right. I'm just going to go ahead and diverge from the article, but I won't read out the full text of SB 219 because, let's just say it's verbose. But this bill directly applies to long-term care facilities, meaning nursing homes in particular. It's not designated toward the general populace of California. That said, there are arguments that this bill would somehow be swept into applying to the average citizen in California, which I just don't see a legitimate case for. So, sorry, I think that narrative might be fake news. The main criticisms I have with this bill are the 2 provisions which read as follows. It shall be unlawful for a long-term care facility or facility staff to 4. prohibit a resident from using or harass a resident who seeks to use or does use a restroom available to other persons of the same gender identity, regardless of whether the resident is making a gender transition or appears to be gender nonconforming. Harassment includes, but is not limited to, requiring a resident to show identity documents in order to gain entrance to a restroom available to other persons of the same gender identity. Now, I would not have an issue with Article 4 here, if it weren't for the fact that it explicitly forbids some kind of objective criteria for determining the gender identity of an individual other than their say-so. You know, I hate to sound like one of those people who thinks that trans folks are just men pretending to be women in some devious plot to perv on people, but when you remove any criteria for distinguishing the gender of an individual, you really may as well just have communal non-gendered restrooms, because they'll be functionally identical. Don't get me wrong, right? I'm not saying that transsexual people don't deserve to use the restroom that matches their gender identity. I just said that my only issue with this is there being no objective criteria here. But if there were ever a group of people where I would expect someone to abuse it to perv on people, it would be some old man who hasn't gotten laid in years and now has an excuse to peek on women in the ladies' restroom. I'm just saying. And number 5, it shall be unlawful for a long-term care facility or facility staff to willfully and repeatedly fail to use a resident's preferred name or pronouns after being clearly informed of the preferred name or pronouns. This strikes me as being problematic from a legal standpoint. This is the kind of thing that will either be unenforceable or unfairly enforced with almost no middle ground. And seeing as how this is California, I can only presume that it will be the latter and not the former. What I mean by this is that you'll have a situation where someone is alleging that a staff member refused to call them by their preferred pronouns, and then that staff member says, "No, I didn't." Where do you go from there? Either the claimant is going to have to prove that the staff member did continuously and intentionally refer to them by the incorrect pronoun, which I highly doubt most senior citizens will be able to prove, or at least not without breaking California's own laws in the process, thus making that evidence inadmissible. Or the defendant will have to prove that they didn't do what the claimant accuses them of, something that is difficult to impossible to do because not doing something doesn't leave any evidence. Something like this would have to be decided entirely by witness or security camera footage if there was any for the interaction, which in many cases I doubt there will be. Given the propensity of laws like this to be unfair towards defendants, I have to assume that it probably will be in this case as well, and I hope it isn't, but it has happened often enough that I would be honestly surprised if it didn't. You know, everything else in this bill is generally alright, but this particular article strikes me as unjust. Beyond the efficacy of such a law, you have the problem that this is something that in legal terms is referred to as a tort. The most well-known tort in US law is defamation, as in slander or libel. And even with these torts, which can cause people to lose hundreds, thousands, millions, even billions of dollars, you still cannot be thrown in jail for them, because I would argue that doing so would be a violation of the 7th Amendment to the Constitution. Progressives usually complain that we always criticize their ideas and don't offer any constructive criticism, but I think I see a better way that someone could work out a law like this. While I don't think that misgendering someone should be a crime in and of itself, there is still a legitimate case here for long-term care staff doing so repeatedly to a transsexual individual. Now, how this should work in a normal business is that the chain of leadership should be invoked in a proper manner. A resident should be filing a complaint with the next highest person above the intendant in question, and then above that person and above that person. Should the complaint go unheeded by the chain of command, then at this point you have a clear failure in leadership due to neglect, willful or not, and this would then legitimize getting the state involved in the affairs between one individual and a business. And this isn't even specific to misgendering an individual. This would be for any general issue you would find at a nursing home or other such place of care or service. If an orderly had a habit of, let's say, not changing a resident's sheets or being unnecessarily rude to an attendant, for any reason, I would expect the same process to be handled. Other than that though, there really is nothing else to take umbrage with in this bill. Well, maybe number 6, which requires, and I quote, that no resident be denied the right to wear or be dressed in clothing, accessories, or cosmetics that are permitted for any other resident. I imagine this will lead to hilarity very quickly. I'm not really much of one to ask for things, but if you find my videos informative, and you might want to support my channel going into the future, please consider pledging $1 over on Patreon. There's a link in the description. If that isn't your thing, then don't worry about it. Just remember to share my videos with people on all sides of an issue. Thank you.